The shield hit the Uruk-hai's face with the sound of a church bell struck by lightning. Captain America's fist followed through, momentum carrying him forward into the seething mass of Saruman's army. The creature's body flew backward, crushing 3 more behind it. Around him, the courtyard of Helm's Deep burned with torch fire and spilled oil. The stench of blood and sulfur choked the air. This wasn't supposed to happen. 30 seconds ago, Steve Rogers had been in New York fighting alongside the Avengers against another Chitauri incursion. Thor's lightning had struck something, some device the aliens were using to stabilize their portal, and reality had screamed. The fabric of existence cracked like glass around the blast point. White light consumed everything. Not the flash of tesseract energy, but the howling brilliance of dimensions colliding. Steve felt himself pulled through a void that tasted like iron and ancient stone, tumbling through sensations that had no names in any human language. Then gravity remembered its purpose. He fell through a night sky illuminated by fire, plummeting toward a fortress carved into a mountainside. Below, thousands of twisted creatures swarmed against stone walls defended by men in armor that belonged in museums. Torches blazed, drums pounded, war cries echoed off cliff faces in a language Steve didn't recognize. Steve hit the ground inside the fortress courtyard. The impact cratered stone sent shockwaves rippling outward that knocked Uruk-hai off their feet. His knees absorbed the landing, enhanced physiology compensating for terminal velocity. And he rose smoothly, shield already up. 50 Uruk-hai turned toward him, yellow eyes gleaming with predatory hunger in faces that looked like nightmare versions of humanity. They carried crude weapons, wore spiked armor, and moved with coordination that spoke of military discipline despite their monstrous appearance. Steve's tactical mind cataloged threats in microseconds. Surrounded, no backup, unknown terrain, civilian population evident from screams above, defensive position compromised, standard Tuesday. The nearest Uruk-hai charged with a roar that shook Steve's ribs. Its sword, crude iron 3 feet long, swung for his head with enough force to decapitate. Steve caught the blade on his shield's edge. Vibranium sang. The sword shattered like glass. The Uruk-hai stared at its broken weapon for one confused heartbeat before Steve's returning strike caved in its chest plate and sent it flying 20 feet backward. The others charged as one. Steve moved through them like a storm through wheat. His shield deflected a spear thrust, the weapon's point crumpling against vibranium physics, while his elbow drove into another Uruk-hai's throat. Spin, low sweep that shattered a knee, rising uppercut that lifted a 300-pound creature off the ground. Shield throw that ricocheted between 3 heads before returning to his hand. The Erskine serum didn't make him superhuman. It made him the peak of human potential. Strength, speed, reflexes, endurance, all pushed to theoretical maximum. In a world of gods and monsters, that made him the most dangerous human alive. In this world, wherever this was, it apparently made him something these creatures had never encountered. Within 90 seconds, 50 Uruk-hai lay unconscious or incapacitated across the courtyard. Steve stood in the center of the carnage, breathing slightly elevated but controlled, shield raised, scanning for additional threats. That's when he heard the voice. "What manner of sorcery is this?" Steve turned. A man approached from the fortress's inner wall, elderly but carrying himself with martial bearing that Steve recognized instantly. Military commander, leader, someone who'd seen decades of combat and survived through skill and will. The man wore armor that gleamed even through the grime of battle. A crown sat atop his helm. Behind him, a dozen warriors formed protective guard, spears leveled at Steve with the nervous energy of soldiers who'd just watched the impossible happen. Steve lowered his shield slightly, non-threatening posture, hands visible. "I'm not your enemy," he said clearly. Those things attacked me. I defended myself. Another figure stepped forward, younger, ranger's clothing, sword at his hip, eyes sharp with intelligence and suspicion. Tall, dark-haired, weathered by travel. This one moved like a fighter, like someone who'd spent years perfecting the craft of staying alive. "You speak the common tongue," the ranger said, accent Steve couldn't place. "European maybe, but older somehow, formalized. Yet you dress in colors unknown to any realm of Middle-earth, and you fell from the sky like a star." Middle-earth. The word hit Steve like physical impact, not Earth. Middle-earth. His enhanced mind processed implications at combat speed. Dimensional breach, alternative reality, parallel world. The theories Banner and Stark had discussed over shawarma after New York suddenly felt less theoretical and more like his new tactical situation. "My name is Steve Rogers," he said, keeping his voice level and calm. "Command presence, established trust. Captain U.S. Army. I was fighting in my world when something went wrong. I didn't mean to intrude on your battle." The crowned man stepped closer, studying Steve with eyes that had witnessed horrors and triumphs both. "I am Theoden, King of Rohan. This is Helm's Deep, and we stand against the forces of Saruman the White." His voice carried exhaustion deeper than physical fatigue, the weariness of someone who'd been betrayed, broken, and only recently remembered how to hope. "If you speak truth, stranger, then your arrival is either the grace of the Valor or some new treachery of the enemy." "The Valor?" Steve asked. "The powers of the West," the ranger explained, hand still on his sword hilt. "The gods of this world, though they have long since withdrawn from the affairs of men." He paused. "I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and if you truly fell through the sky and survived, if you can fight as we just witnessed, then perhaps—" A horn blast cut through the conversation, desperate, urgent, the sound of "reinforce the wall now" in any language, any world, any era. Theoden's head snapped toward the sound. "The deeping wall, they've breached the culvert." He turned to his guards. "With me, every man to the wall." Steve didn't hesitate. "I'm with you." Aragorn's eyes met his. A moment of assessment passed between them. Two soldiers recognizing something familiar in each other despite impossible circumstances. Then the ranger nodded once. "Stay close. These Uruk-hai are bred for war. They know no fear and show no mercy." "Sounds familiar," Steve said, falling into formation as the defenders rushed toward the breach. They ran through corridors carved from living rock, past women and children huddled in alcoves with terror-bright eyes, following the sounds of combat that grew louder with each turn. The smell intensified. Blood, smoke, and something else. Something chemical and wrong. They burst onto a wall section where hell had erupted. 200 Uruk-hai had forced their way through an explosion breach in the lower wall. They poured into the fortress like a flood of fangs and blades, overwhelming the thin defensive line. Defenders fell screaming. The line buckled. In seconds, the breach would widen enough to become unstoppable. Theoden drew his sword, face set with grim determination. Around him, his remaining guards prepared for what looked like a final stand. Steve saw the tactical situation with crystal clarity. The breach was 20 feet wide. Uruk-hai were packed too tightly to maneuver effectively. Confined space. Perfect choke point if someone could hold it long enough for reinforcements to establish a proper defensive line. "I'll hold the breach," Steve said. Aragorn stared at him. "Alone? That's suicide." "I can do this all day," Steve replied and jumped. He dropped 15 feet to the breach point, shield first. The impact scattered Uruk-hai like bowling pins. Before they could recover, Steve was moving. In close quarters against enemies who relied on overwhelming force over refined technique, The super soldier serum made Steve Rogers into something approaching myth. His shield became a whirlwind of vibranium impossibility, blocking, striking, deflecting. Every movement economy perfected, no wasted motion, no unnecessary flourishes. An Uruk-hai swung a battle axe. Steve ducked, let momentum carry the creature past him, shield struck its spine. Another lunged with a spear. Steve caught the haft, snapped it like a twig, drove the broken end through its wielder's leg. Spinning back fist that crumpled a jaw. Shield throw that bounced between foreheads like a ricocheting bullet before returning to his hand. The super soldier formula had given him the ability to process combat information at accelerated rates. He saw openings before they appeared. Predicted movements through muscle tension and weight distribution, turned enemy numbers into disadvantage by controlling spacing and timing. For 2 minutes, Steve Rogers held the deeping wall breach alone. 2 minutes was enough. Aragorn arrived with reinforcements. Rohan's best warriors pouring into the gap with renewed courage. They formed a shield wall, spears bristling, and began pushing the Uruk-hai back through the breach. The line stabilized. The flood became a trickle. Steve stood at the center of the defensive formation, chest heaving slightly, vibranium shield splattered with dark blood that wasn't his own. Around him, warriors of Rohan stared with expressions mixing awe, fear, and desperate hope. Theoden descended the stairs from the wall above, and in the torchlit chaos, Steve saw the king's face clearly for the first time. Worn, weathered, a man who'd lived decades under shadow and only recently found light again. But his eyes held something now they hadn't before. Belief. "Captain Rogers," Theoden said formally, voice carrying across the suddenly quiet breach. "You fight like the heroes of old. Like the legends my father told me as a child." He stepped closer. "If you are truly a warrior displaced from another realm, and if you seek purpose while you remain in ours, then Rohan would welcome your aid." Steve looked around at the defenders, young men and old, farmers and soldiers, people who'd come to this fortress because they had nowhere else to go. Because this was the last wall between their families and annihilation. He'd seen this before. Different worlds, different wars. Same story. People who needed someone to stand between them and the darkness. "What do you need?" Steve asked simply. Theoden's expression shifted into something approaching grim satisfaction. "At dawn, we ride out. 10,000 Uruk-hai surround this fortress. Inside these walls, we will eventually be overwhelmed. But if we can break their siege, scatter their forces, perhaps some of our people can escape to the mountains." "A cavalry charge?" Steve's tactical mind immediately began processing the logistics. "Against 10,000? What kind of numbers are we talking?" 300 riders, Aragorn said quietly. "Perhaps fewer after tonight's losses." The math was brutal. Suicidal, really. 300 cavalry against 10,000 infantry, even with surprise and downhill momentum, would be slaughter. But Steve had fought worse odds, and he'd learned long ago that sometimes the tactically sound choice was to do the impossible anyway because people were counting on you. "Then I ride with you," Steve said. Theoden studied him for a long moment. Then slowly, the king nodded. "You honor Rohan, Captain Rogers. Let us speak more in the hall. We have hours yet before dawn, and I would know more of the warrior who fell from the stars to fight beside us." The great hall of Helm's Deep smelled of smoke, sweat, and fear barely, contained by desperate courage. Wounded men lay on makeshift pallets while healers moved between them with bandages and herbs. Women and children huddled in corners, eyes hollow with exhaustion. The sounds of battle had momentarily quieted, but everyone knew it was temporary. Dawn would bring either salvation or death. Steve stood before a tactical map carved into the hall's central table. The map showed Helm's Deep's layout, The fortress proper, the deeping wall, the causeway leading down to the plains where Saruman's army waited. Around the table gathered what remained of Rohan's leadership. Theoden, king and commander. Aragorn, ranger and tactician. Legolas, an elf whose ears alone marked him as something beyond human. Gimli, a dwarf whose beard reached his belt and whose attitude suggested he'd outlive everyone through sheer stubbornness. Éomer, who'd arrived with reinforcements during the battle and now studied Steve with the protective suspicion of a bodyguard assessing threats to his king. 10,000 Uruk-hai, Theoden said, pointing to markings on the map. They surround the fortress on 3 sides. The 4th is mountain, impassable. At dawn, we ride down the causeway. His finger traced the path. We will have surprise, momentum, downhill charge. For perhaps 5 minutes, these advantages will matter. And then, Steve asked, though he already knew the answer. Then we die, Gimli stated bluntly, tone suggesting he'd already made peace with this outcome. But we'll take enough of the filth with us that the survivors might escape. Better than waiting in here for them to dig us out like rats. Steve studied the map with the intensity he'd once applied to battlefield layouts in LOTR. The causeway was narrow, 300 yards long, 40 feet wide. It formed a natural choke point that limited how many Uruk-hai could engage at once. That was good. The downhill slope would add momentum to the charge. Also good. But at the bottom, the causeway opened into a wide plain where the Uruk-hai could envelop the riders from all sides. That was bad. What about their discipline? Steve asked. Do they hold formation under pressure? Do they have strategic leadership or just tactical? Aragorn leaned forward, interested. They fight with unnatural coordination. Saruman has bred them for war. They know no fear, feel no pain. But they lack creativity. Once committed to an attack, they pursue it regardless of cost. Steve nodded, mind already working. So they're shock troops. Overwhelming force, direct assault, not trained for adaptive response to changing battlefield conditions. Aye, Éomer said slowly. But what does that matter against such numbers? It matters because numbers mean nothing if you can't bring them to bear effectively. Steve looked up from the map, meeting each warrior's eyes in turn. The causeway is your advantage. It forces them into a killing field where only 100 can engage at once. If you can break that first line, really break it, create chaos, the momentum will carry into their rear ranks. They'll become their own obstacle. Legolas spoke for the first time, voice melodic but carrying the weight of centuries. The idea has merit, but breaking that first line requires force beyond what 300 riders can deliver. We would be crushed against them like waves against stone. Not if I lead the charge, Steve said. Silence fell across the hall. Theoden broke it. You speak of riding at the front, the first to strike their lines, the first to die, the first to break their formation, Steve corrected. I've fought in situations like this before. Different world, same principle. If you can shatter their front line's cohesion in the first 30 seconds, create psychological shock, their entire formation destabilizes. They stop fighting as an army and start fighting as individuals. He straightened, authority entering his voice. The tone of someone who'd led men through impossible odds and brought them home. In my world, I led soldiers against an army that thought it was unstoppable. We were outnumbered, outgunned, fighting an enemy that had advantages we couldn't match. But we won because we fought smarter, because we understood that morale and momentum matter more than numbers. Gimli snorted, though his eyes held calculation. Pretty speech, lad. But speeches don't stop axes. No, Steve agreed. Training, tactics, and courage stop axes. You have courage, I've seen that. You have some tactical sense or you'd all be dead already. What you lack is force concentration at the critical point. That's what I can provide." Aragorn studied him with renewed intensity. "What exactly can you do that makes you so certain?" Steve held up his shield. The vibranium disc gleamed in torchlight, its star marking foreign and strange in this ancient hall. "This shield is made from a metal that doesn't exist in your world. It absorbs kinetic energy. Arrows, blades, battering rams, none of it can penetrate. I could stand in front of your army and the Uruk-hai couldn't reach you. Not immediately." He set the shield down. "Beyond that, I'm enhanced. Stronger, faster, more durable than normal humans. Not invincible, but close enough for our purposes. If I hit their line at full speed, I'll create a gap. Your riders follow through that gap before it closes. We drive deep into their formation, creating chaos. Then when they're confused and disorganized, we wheel and ride for the flanks." "Madness," Ilmer muttered. But he was looking at the map again, recalculating. Theoden remained silent, his weathered face thoughtful. Finally he spoke, voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made impossible choices before. "Captain Rogers, I have led men to death. I have ordered charges I knew would not succeed because some defiance must be offered even in defeat. But I have also learned to recognize when hope is delusion, and when it is wisdom wrapped in audacity." He stepped closer, studying Steve with eyes that had witnessed both. "You fell from the sky. You fought 50 Uruk-hai alone and prevailed. You held the breach when it should have fallen. Either you are a gift from the Valar, or you are the most magnificent fool I have ever encountered." A slight smile touched his lips. "Either way, I will ride beside you at dawn." Steve felt something settle in his chest. Recognition between soldiers who understood the weight of command. "Thank you, Your Majesty." "Do not thank me yet," Theoden said dryly. "We may all be dead by noon." He turned to his assembled warriors. "Prepare the riders. Full armor, lances, best horses. We ride at first light." As the others dispersed to make preparations, Aragorn lingered, gesturing for Steve to follow him to a quieter corner of the hall. The ranger's expression carried questions deeper than tactics. "You speak of another world," Aragorn said quietly, "of fighting armies and leading soldiers. But you are young, younger than me, and I have wandered Middle-earth for 8 decades. He paused. "What are you, truly?" Steve considered how much to reveal. These people had accepted him despite impossible circumstances. They deserved honesty. "In my world, I was given an enhancement, a serum that pushed human capabilities to their theoretical maximum. I was part of a war, a great war against tyranny. We won, but at a cost. I was frozen in ice for 70 years. When I woke, the world had moved on." Aragorn's eyes widened slightly. "You are older than you appear." "By calendar, yes. By experience," Steve shrugged. "I'm still figuring that out." The ranger studied him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, a brief, genuine expression. "We are alike, you and I. Warriors out of time, carrying burdens we did not choose, fighting for people who may never understand what we sacrifice." He extended his hand in the manner of his people. "Whatever fate brought you here, Captain, I am glad to have you beside me in the darkness." Steve gripped his forearm, feeling the warrior's strength in the clasp. "Call me Steve." "Steve," Aragorn tested the name. "It suits you. Practical, unpretentious. The name of someone who values deeds over titles." He released the grip. "Come. I'll show you to the armory. That shield may be proof against their weapons, but the rest of you could use proper protection." The armory of Helm's Deep was cramped and smoky, lit by a single torch that cast dancing shadows across racks of weapons and armor. Most of the quality pieces were already distributed to riders or too damaged for continued use. What remained was serviceable but worn, the gear of garrison troops and reserves. Aragorn moved through the space with practiced efficiency, pulling pieces from various racks. You'll need mail. The Uruk-hai use crude weapons, but they're effective. If you're riding in the van, you'll take hits regardless of skill. Steve accepted the chainmail. Shirt? Heavy, about 40 pounds, but his enhanced strength barely registered the weight. The metal was cold against his chest as he pulled it over his head, the ring settling with the distinctive sound that had remained unchanged across centuries of warfare. Legolas appeared in the doorway, moving with the preternatural silence that made Steve's tactical instincts itch. The elf carried a bow that looked organic rather than constructed, like it had been grown rather than carved. "Aragorn," Legolas said, his ageless face thoughtful. "I have been considering our new companion. His presence disturbs me." Steve tensed, hand drifting toward his shield. Legolas noticed the movement and raised a hand. "Peace, Captain. Not disturbance as in threat. Disturbance as in disruption. You are not of this world. Your presence here creates ripples in the song of Arda." "Song?" Steve asked. "All things have music," Legolas explained with the patience of someone describing color to the blind. "The elves hear it, the melody of existence itself. You, Captain Rogers, have no song, or rather you have a song that does not harmonize with anything in Middle-earth. It is..." He searched for words. "Dissonant. Foreign. Wrong, though not evil." Aragorn finished strapping a sword belt around Steve's waist, a simple blade, well-maintained but unremarkable. "What are you saying, Legolas?" "I am saying that his arrival may have been noticed by powers greater than Saruman." The elf's eyes, ancient despite his youthful appearance, met Steve's. "The Dark Lord in Barad-dûr has means of perceiving disturbances in the fabric of Arda. If you truly fell through a breach in reality itself, Sauron's gaze may already be turning toward Helm's Deep, wondering what new player has entered the game." Steve absorbed this information with the calm of someone who'd faced alien invasions and Norse gods. Another cosmic-level threat was concerning but not paralyzing. "Is there anything we can do about it right now?" "No," Legolas admitted. "I merely thought you should know. Your presence here will have consequences beyond this battle. Consequences we'll face when we reach them," Aragorn said firmly. "For now, we focus on surviving dawn." He handed Steve a helmet, simple iron, practical rather than ornate. "This should fit." Steve tested the helmet's weight and balance. It was heavier than his usual cowl, less protective than modern combat helmets, but it would do. "What about the horses? I've ridden before, but not in combat." Gimli's voice boomed from behind them as the dwarf entered the armory, carrying an axe that looked larger than should be comfortable. "Ridden before? Lad, have you ever ridden a Rohirrim warhorse at full gallop down a mountainside into 10,000 slavering Uruks?" "Can't say I have," Steve admitted. "Then you're in for an education." Gimli grinned through his beard. "The horses of Rohan are the finest in Middle-earth. Smart, strong, and mean when they need to be. They'll carry you true, but hold tight to the reins or you'll find yourself on the ground wondering how the world got so far away." A new voice spoke from the armory entrance, young, male, carrying the confidence of nobility and the uncertainty of inexperience. "Master Dwarf speaks truth. The horses know their business better than most riders." Steve turned to see a young man in fine armor, blonde hair, similar features to Theoden. Family resemblance was obvious. "I'm Prince Theodred," the young man said, though something in his bearing suggested the title sat uncomfortably. "My father sent me to ensure our guest has everything needed for the charge." Aragorn's expression flickered, something between concern and resignation. "Theodred, you should be with the wounded. Your injuries from the fords are healed enough. Theodred interrupted firmly. I will not hide in the hold while my father rides to possible death. The king's son rides beside the king. That is the way of Rohan. Steve recognized the tone. Duty warring with self-preservation. Honor demanding sacrifice regardless of common sense. He'd heard similar speeches from young soldiers in WW2, boys trying to become men faster than time allowed. No one's questioning your courage, Steve said carefully. But your father needs experienced riders in that charge. If you're still recovering... I can ride, Theodred said, voice hardening. I can fight. That is enough. Aragorn and Steve exchanged glances. The ranger's expression said he'd already had this argument and lost. Steve nodded fractionally. Some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when pride was involved. Then ride in the second rank, Steve suggested. Let me and your father break the line. You and the others follow through the gap. Coordinate the wheel movement when we reach penetration depth. Theodred considered this, recognizing it as a compromise that still allowed him to fight while reducing immediate danger. That is... acceptable. Thank you, Captain. As the prince left to prepare his horse, Gimli snorted. Smooth, lad. You've got a way with noble fools. I was a noble fool once, Steve said quietly. Someone gave me a chance to prove I was more than my pride. Figure I can pay that forward. Legolas tilted his head, studying Steve with renewed interest. You carry wisdom unusual for one so young-seeming. Perhaps that is the gift of your frozen years. Time to reflect without the burden of aging. Or maybe I just made a lot of mistakes and learned from them, Steve replied, settling the helmet on his head. The weight distributed evenly, visibility adequate. It would work. How much time until dawn? Aragorn checked the narrow window, where pre-dawn gray was just beginning to stain the darkness. 3 hours, perhaps 4. You should rest. I should check the horses, make sure mine is properly geared. Steve started toward the door. And I should talk to some of the riders, make sure they know the plan. You've led men before, Aragorn observed. Statement, not question. Different men, different war, same principles. Steve paused at the doorway. But yeah, I've led charges before. Some worked, some didn't. The ones that worked were when everyone knew their part and trusted each other to execute. He headed into the corridor toward the stables where 300 riders were preparing for a charge that might be their last. Behind him, Legolas spoke softly to Aragorn in Elvish. Steve's enhanced hearing caught fragments, words about fate, doom, and strangers who fell from stars. He didn't need translation to understand the concern. The stables were organized chaos, 300 horses being armed and armored while their riders made final preparations. The smell of horses, leather, and weapon oil filled the cramped space. Men worked with practiced efficiency born of tradition. Rohirrim had been horse lords for generations. This was their heritage, their pride. Steve moved through the stable rows, observing preparations with tactical assessment. The horses were magnificent, tall, muscular, intelligent eyes that tracked movement with more awareness than he'd expected. The armor was minimal, leather and light mail that protected vitals without restricting movement. Smart. Mobility would matter more than protection in the planned charge. A stable master approached, grizzled, missing teeth, arms corded with muscle from decades of handling war horses. You're the one from the sky, he stated rather than asked. King says you need a mount. Your best, Steve said. I'll be leading the charge. Can't have the horse deciding it doesn't like the odds. The stable master's lips twitched into something approaching a smile. Confidence. Good. The horses smell fear and they don't follow cowards. He led Steve deeper into the stables, past rows of restless animals, until they reached a stall containing a gray stallion that stood a hand taller than its neighbors. The horse studied Steve with eyes that held calculation beyond animal instinct, weighing, judging. "This is Shadowmere," the stable master said. "Theoden's reserve mount, strong, fast, mean when he needs to be, and smart enough to know when to run and when to fight. He's carried the king through 3 battles and never faltered." Steve approached slowly, hand extended, letting the horse process his scent. Enhanced senses picked up the animal's rapid heartbeat, the tension in its muscles, the wariness in its posture. This was a creature bred for war, trained for violence, but still subject to fear and doubt like any living thing. "Hey there," Steve said quietly. "I know I'm not what you're used to, not from around here. But I need you to trust me for a few hours, just a few hours, and then you can rest. Can you do that?" The horse's ear flicked toward his voice. Something in Steve's tone, the calm certainty that had carried him through frozen Alps and Chitauri invasions, seemed to register. Shadowmere lowered his head fractionally, allowing Steve to touch his neck. "He likes you," the stable master said, surprise evident. "Usually takes weeks to earn that one's respect. You've a way with beasts, Starfaller." "I just treat them honestly," Steve replied, stroking Shadowmere's neck. The horse's muscles were coiled springs beneath the skin, raw power waiting for direction. "What about gear?" For the next hour, Steve worked with the stable master to prepare Shadowmere for battle. War saddle with high pommel and cantle to keep the rider secure during violent maneuvering. Reins shorter than standard to allow one-handed control. Steve would need his shield hand free. Minimal barding, just enough to protect the chest and flanks without limiting speed. As they worked, riders began gathering, drawn by curiosity about the stranger who would lead them to glory or death. Steve recognized the look in their eyes. Young men and old farmers and professional soldiers, all united by the knowledge that dawn would demand everything they had. One rider stepped forward, middle-aged, scarred face, sergeant's bearing. "You fought at the breach, held it alone for 2 minutes." "Something like that," Steve acknowledged, checking Shadowmere's saddle straps. "The lads are saying you're a gift from the Valar, that you fell from heaven to save Rohan." The rider's tone suggested skepticism warring with desperate hope. "Are you?" Steve straightened, meeting the man's eyes directly. "I'm a soldier from another world who ended up here by accident. I don't know about Valar or heaven. What I do know is that there are 10,000 enemies outside these walls, and 300 of us are going to ride through them at dawn. That's not divine intervention, that's just courage and good tactics." He addressed the growing crowd now, voice carrying across the stable with command presence earned through years of leadership. "I've fought in situations like this before. Outnumbered, surrounded, facing an enemy that thought we couldn't win. But we did win, because we fought smart and we fought together." He pointed toward the causeway entrance, visible through the stable's far opening. "That slope is your advantage. That narrow approach is their disadvantage. If we break their line in the first 30 seconds, create real chaos, their numbers become a liability. They'll stumble over each other. Their coordination will collapse. That's when disciplined cavalry with momentum can do damage far beyond their numbers." "And if we don't break the line?" someone called from the back. "Then we die," Steve said simply. "But we'll die taking enough of them with us that the people in this fortress have a chance to escape. That's the mission. That's what soldiers do. We buy time with our lives so others can survive." Silence fell. The riders processed his words with the grim understanding of men who'd already made peace with mortality. Then the sergeant who'd first spoken stepped forward and extended his arm in the warrior's clasp. "I'm Grimbold. I'll ride behind you, Starfaller. If you say there's a chance, I'll take it." Others followed one by one, clasping arms with Steve in the traditional gesture. Not worship, not blind faith, just soldiers acknowledging another soldier, accepting leadership because it was offered with competence rather than demanded through rank. By the time the last rider had made his oath, Steve understood why Rohan had survived. These weren't blindly obedient troops. They were a brotherhood of warriors who fought because they chose to, because their land demanded it, because their people needed them. He'd seen the same spirit in the Howling Commandos, in the early Avengers, in every good unit he'd ever served with. "Gear up," Steve ordered. "Final checks on saddles, weapons, armor. Dawn's coming and we ride when the first light touches the mountains." The riders dispersed to their preparations. Steve returned to Shadowmere, completing the final adjustments to the war saddle. The horse stood patient under his ministrations, only occasionally tossing its head when a strap pulled too tight. Aragorn materialized beside him, appearing from shadows like Batman used to in the old days. "You've won them over, that's good. They'll fight harder for a leader they trust." "Trust has to be earned," Steve replied, testing the stirrups. "I just told them the truth. Sometimes that's enough. Not always, but often enough to matter." Aragorn paused, then spoke quietly. "Steve, there's something you should know. The charge we're planning, in our history, such charges are legendary, remembered in song for thousands of years, but the riders who make them rarely survive to hear the songs." "I know." Steve met the ranger's eyes. "But someone has to go first. Someone always has to go first. That's what leadership means. You don't ask your people to do anything you wouldn't do yourself. And if I can take the hardest hit, absorb the worst of their initial assault, then the riders behind me have a better chance." Aragorn studied him for a long moment. Then slowly he smiled, a warrior's smile, grim but genuine. "You would have made a fine king of Gondor, or a fine ranger of the north, or perhaps just a fine friend to have in dark times." "I'll settle for useful," Steve said, returning the smile. "Everything else is extra." A horn sounded from the fortress's upper levels, a single clear note that cut through the pre-dawn darkness. 1 hour to sunrise. "Come," Aragorn said. "Theoden wishes to speak with you before we ride." They found Theoden in the Great Hall, standing before a window that overlooked the plains below. The king wore full battle armor now, polished plate that caught torchlight, a helm adorned with horsehair plume, a sword at his hip that looked old enough to have stories attached. Behind him, his banner hung from the rafters, a white horse on green field. He didn't turn as they entered, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the window where 10,000 enemies waited for light to reveal them. "My grandfather led a charge once," Theoden said quietly, "at the Battle of Azanul-Bizar beneath the gates of Moria. Dwarves and men together against orcs that had desecrated a sacred place. They rode at dawn, just as we will. 3,000 riders against 15,000 enemies." He paused. 2,000 riders didn't return. Steve waited, recognizing the moment for what it was. A leader processing fear and duty before committing to irreversible action. He told me years later when I was a boy that he knew the odds, knew that most of his riders would die, but someone had to answer the challenge. Someone had to show that evil could be opposed, even at terrible cost. Because if good men do nothing, if courage is abandoned for prudence, then darkness wins by default. Theoden finally turned, his weathered face illuminated by flickering torchlight. I thought I understood him then. I didn't. Not really. Not until now. He crossed to Steve, studying him with eyes that had witnessed both betrayal and redemption. "You have given my people hope, Captain Rogers. Real hope, not false comfort. For that I am grateful. But I must ask, if our charge fails, If we break against their lines and die, will you use your abilities to escape? Save yourself while you can, the question hung in the air. Steve understood what Theoden was really asking. Are you a mercenary using us for temporary alliance? Or are you truly with us until the end? I don't leave soldiers behind, Steve said simply. I don't abandon people who trusted me to lead them. If the charge fails, I'll be there when it fails. And if we're dying, I'll be dying with the rest of you. Theoden's eyes searched his face, looking for deception or bravado, finding only honest commitment. You truly mean that? Yes, the king nodded slowly. Then Rohan could not ask for a better warrior to ride beside. He clasped Steve's shoulder, the grip of a brother in arms, not a king to subordinate. When we ride out, you will carry the king's banner beside me. Let Saruman's filth see that Rohan stands with a warrior who fell from the stars. Let them wonder what other powers may be marshaled against them. Your Majesty, Aragorn interjected carefully. Traditionally, your banner is carried by your shield-bearer. To give it to an outsider is precisely the message I wish to send, Theoden finished. Rohan does not stand alone. Even the heavens themselves send warriors to our aid. His voice hardened with determination that had been absent when Steve first saw him. Saruman thought us broken, defeated, ready for harvest. Let us teach him that Rohan remembers how to bare its teeth. A horn sounded again. Closer, more urgent. Dawn was 30 minutes away. To your horses, Theoden commanded. All riders to the causeway entrance. We assemble when the sun first breaks the horizon. The causeway entrance was packed with 300 mounted riders in loose formation. Horses stamped and snorted, breath misting in the cold pre-dawn air. Men checked weapons a final time, swords loose in scabbards, lances balanced and ready, shields adjusted on arms. The smell of horse, leather, and fierce sweat filled the confined space. Steve sat astride Shadowmere at the formation's head, slightly to the right of Theoden's position. The king's banner hung from a lance fixed to his saddle, a white horse on green field, clearly visible even in dim light. His shield was maglocked to his left arm, vibranium surface dull in the pre-dawn gray. Chainmail lay heavy across his shoulders. The unfamiliar weight of a sword pulled at his hip. He felt exposed without his usual gear. No comms, no tactical readouts, no air support on call. Just horse, armor, and 300 riders who'd placed their faith in his confidence. Behind him, the riders formed up in ranks of 15 across, 20 deep. Experienced warriors at the front, younger or less skilled toward the rear. Theoden had organized them with brutal practicality. The veterans would hit first and hardest. The survivors would learn from watching their elders. Aragorn maneuvered his horse next to Steve's left side, bow strung and ready. Legolas took position on Theoden's right, elegant even in the awkward practicality of mounted combat. Gimli, surprisingly, had convinced someone to let him ride behind Legolas. The dwarf's short legs made traditional riding impossible, so he'd settled for clinging to the elf's waist with his axe secured across his back. This is a terrible idea, Gimli grumbled. Dwarves are not meant to ride horses. We're meant to fight with solid ground under our feet. You could have stayed in the fortress, Legolas replied mildly. And miss watching you lot die gloriously? Never. The dwarf shifted his grip. Besides, someone needs to keep count. I've got 15 Uruk-hai from the wall breach. You've got 12. Rogers there has 50-something. We'll settle the competition properly today. You're keeping score? Steve asked, incredulous. Always, Gimli said cheerfully. What's the point of killing orcs if no one remembers you did it? Despite everything, Steve found himself smiling. The dwarf's attitude reminded him of Dumb Dugan, another warrior who'd faced death with jokes and courage in equal measure. Theoden raised his hand for silence. The morning sound ceased. 300 riders waited. The king's voice carried across the assembly, formal and powerful. Sons of Rohan, brothers in arms, today we ride for honor. We ride for our people. We ride because Rohan never kneels to darkness. Agreement rumbled through the ranks. Swords beat against shields in ancient rhythm. Some of you will fall, Theoden continued, voice never wavering. Some of us will not see tomorrow's sun, but we will be remembered. Our children's children will sing of this day, the day Rohan reminded Middle-earth that free people do not yield to tyranny. The rhythm of sword on shield intensified. We ride at dawn, we ride together, and we ride to victory or to glory in defeat. Theoden drew his sword, lifting it high. Forth, Yorlingus! The cry was taken up by 300 throats. Yorlingus! Yorlingus! Steve felt the moment crystallize. This was it, the point of no return. Behind them, families waited. Ahead, an army of darkness that wanted to extinguish hope itself. He'd been here before. Different names, different enemies, same choice. Stand and fight or let evil win by default. The eastern horizon began to glow. First light touching distant peaks, dawn breaking across Middle-earth. Theoden looked at Steve, king to warrior. Captain Rogers, the honor is yours. Lead us out. Steve nodded once. He touched his heels to Shadowmere's flanks. The warhorse responded instantly, moving forward through the causeway gate and onto the steep downward slope beyond. Behind him, 300 riders followed. The charge had begun. The causeway stretched before Steve like a stone knife pointed at the heart of Saruman's army. 40 feet wide, 300 yards long, carved into the mountainside with walls on either side that limited visibility but focused force. The slope was steep, 20 degrees, maybe more, adding gravity's blessing to the charge's momentum. Dawn light crawled across the plains below, revealing the horror waiting there. 10,000 Uruk-hai. Not an estimate, actual count. They covered the ground in front of Helm's Deep like a living carpet of armor and blades. Organized in crude formations, blocks of infantry, clusters of archers, mobile reserves near the edges. Drums beat a constant rhythm. Torches still burned despite approaching daylight. Steve's enhanced vision picked out details that should have been invisible at this distance. Individual faces twisted with hatred. Weapons raised in anticipation. Officers, larger Uruks with better armor, bellowing orders in a guttural language that carried across the killing field. They'd been expecting the defenders to die quietly in the fortress. They weren't expecting 300 riders to charge out at dawn. The surprise wouldn't last long. Steve leaned forward in the saddle, shield arm extended, settling into the combat mindset that had carried him through 100 battles. Shadowmere felt the shift in his posture and responded, muscles coiling, preparing for violence. Behind him, hooves struck stone in building thunder. The sound echoed off the causeway walls, a growing avalanche of steel and horseflesh. 300 voices began a war cry that started as whisper and built toward a roar. The Uruk-hai at the causeway's base were starting to react. Confusion rippling through their ranks, officers screaming orders. Formations beginning to shift, but slowly. Too slowly. Steve did the math in his head. Shadowmere was hitting 15 miles per hour now, accelerating, on the downslope. 200 yards to impact. At current rate, 12 seconds to contact. 12 seconds to prepare for the hardest hit of his life. He adjusted his shield, angling it for maximum coverage, and tucked slightly lower in the saddle. Shadowmere's neck extended as the horse reached full gallop, hooves hammering stone, war-bred instincts overriding survival instinct. The Uruk-hai raised a forest of pikes and spears. a wall of blades designed to impale horses and riders alike. Standard medieval defense against cavalry, effective for thousands of years across hundreds of battles. They'd never faced vibranium. 5 seconds to impact. Steve's world narrowed to the approaching pike wall. His enhanced perception processed everything in crystalline detail. The way the Uruks braced themselves, the angle of the pikes, the weak points in their formation where individual warriors had slightly different spacing. 3 seconds. He picked his point of impact, a slight gap where 2 Uruks hadn't coordinated perfectly. He aimed Shadowmere toward it, trusting the warhorse to understand. 1 second. Steve raised his shield and braced. Impact. Shadowmere hit the Uruk-hai line like a meteor strike. The horse's momentum, the downhill acceleration, Steve's enhanced mass, it all combined into force that couldn't be stopped by mere muscle and determination. Pikes shattered against vibranium. The Uruks trying to hold the line flew backward, bones breaking from the kinetic transfer. Shadowmere's chest armor crushed the ones who didn't move fast enough. The gap Steve had aimed for became a hole, then a breach, then a tunnel as the warhorse carved through flesh and steel. Steve's shield swept in a wide arc, knocking aside Uruks who tried to engage. His sword, just a normal blade, inadequate for his strength, snapped a Uruk's spear haft and carved through the creature's shoulder in the same motion. Shadowmere reared iron-shod hooves crushing a skull, then launched forward again. Behind Steve, Theoden and the first rank of riders hit the breach he'd created. The king's sword flashed in dawn light. Aragorn's blade sang as it cleared leather. Legolas's bow hummed, releasing arrows faster than should be possible. The Uruk-hai line exploded into chaos. This was the moment, the critical 30 seconds where momentum and surprise outweighed numerical advantage. Steve had seen it in WE2, watched it in tactical simulations, lived it in New York against Chitauri forces. An army's greatest vulnerability was the second after their formation broke, when individual soldiers lost connection to unit cohesion, when orders became impossible to communicate, when discipline shattered into self-preservation. The Rohirrim drove deep into that vulnerability like a spear into flesh. Steve's shield found a rhythm, block, strike, enhanced strength making every impact devastating. Shadowmere moved beneath him with almost preternatural awareness, dodging pike, thrusts, trampling Uruks who got too close, working in partnership rather than simple obedience. Around him, the riders of Rohan demonstrated why they were legendary. Lance strikes that punched through armor, sword work that was brutal and efficient. Coordination born of generations riding together. They were a hammer, and the Uruk-hai were the anvil. But anvils don't break easily. The initial momentum began to slow, inevitable physics. 300 riders could only push so far before mass and numbers reasserted dominance. The Uruk-hai formations behind the shattered front line were recovering, moving to envelop the cavalry, preparing to drag riders from horses and overwhelm them through sheer weight. Steve saw it happening with tactical clarity. Another 30 seconds and they'd be stuck, pinned, slaughtered. "Theoden!" Steve's voice carried across the chaos. "Wheel right! Now!" The king heard him, understood immediately. "Right!" Theoden's command echoed through the rider ranks. "Wheel right! Maintain momentum!" The cavalry formation began to turn, using speed and surprise to avoid complete entrapment. It was a practiced maneuver. Rohirrim had been executing cavalry wheels for centuries. But doing it in the middle of an enemy formation, surrounded by 10,000 enemies under fire from archers who were finally getting organized, that was something else entirely. An Uruk-hai pike caught Shadowmere's hindquarters. The horse screamed but didn't stumble, training overriding pain. Steve felt the impact through the saddle, sensed the injury wasn't immediately critical. and drove his shield backward, catching the pike wielder in the face. Arrows began falling, black feathered shafts designed to punch through mail. Steve raised his shield overhead, creating an umbrella of vibranium protection for himself and nearby riders. Arrows struck and fell harmlessly. Other riders weren't as fortunate. Steve heard screams as some found gaps in armor. The wheel maneuver was working. The cavalry formation bent into a curve, maintaining forward momentum while changing direction. Uruks trying to intercept got trampled or scattered. The riders were pulling away from the main formation, heading toward the flanks where defenses were thinner. But the cost was mounting. Steve saw riders fall, empty saddles, horses stumbling. The precise count was impossible in the chaos, but his tactical mind estimated 15 casualties, maybe 20. Acceptable by brutal military mathematics. Devastating by human metrics. They broke free of the main formation, wheeling wide around the Uruk-hai's left flank. Open ground ahead for precious seconds, space to breathe and reform. Theoden pulled his horse alongside Steve's, face bloodied but eyes fierce. "Captain, their right flank collapses. If we can strike there—" "No," Steve cut him off. "We break off now. Live to fight again. If we go back in, they'll be ready." "We're winning," Theoden protested. "Look at them. They're in disarray. For now, but we've lost 20 riders and every horse is exhausted. One more charge and we'll lose 50, then they'll swarm us." Steve pointed toward the mountains. "We break off, regroup, wait for our next advantage." Theoden's jaw clenched. Every warrior instinct demanding they press the advantage, but his eyes showed understanding. He'd been a king long enough to recognize when courage became stupidity. "Riders!" Theoden's command rang across the formation. "Break north, to the mountains. Reform at some—" The sun crested the eastern horizon, full dawn breaking across the plains, and with it, a sound like the world ending. A horn, deep, resonant. The kind of sound that made mountains tremble and brave men reconsider their choices. Steve turned in his saddle, looking back toward the rising sun. Riders, thousands of them, cresting a ridge 2 miles to the east. Sunlight glinting off armor and spear points, banners flying, a white horse on green field, but also others, blue and silver, red and gold. At their head rode a figure in white robes that glowed with early morning light. Staff raised high, long beard flowing in the wind of his passage. Legolas's voice carried wonder. "Gandalf." "Gandalf?" Steve asked. "A wizard," Aragorn explained, relief flooding his voice. "One of the Astari. He left us days ago. I thought—" He stopped. "He's brought the reinforcements Theoden's nephew was supposed to gather. 2,000 riders at least." Theoden stared at the approaching army with an expression that mixed disbelief, hope, and something approaching religious awe. "Eomer, my nephew, he's brought them." Tears streaked the blood on his face. "We are not abandoned." The Uruk-hai had seen the approaching army too. Their formations were shifting, uncertainty rippling through ranks that moments ago had been confident in victory. 10,000 was a comfortable advantage against 300. Against 3,000 with momentum and the sun at their backs? Different calculation entirely. Steve felt the battle's momentum shift like a physical thing. This was the moment, the cusp, victory or defeat balanced on the next 5 minutes. "Theoden," Steve said urgently, "we can still win this, but we need to coordinate. When Gandalf's riders hit their rear, you wheel your cavalry back and hit their flank." Pincer movement. Classic hammer and anvil. The king processed this, tactical mind engaging despite emotional turmoil. "Our horses are exhausted. One more charge, that's all we need. Break their formation, let fear take root." Steve met Theoden's eyes. "One more charge and Saruman's army dies here." For a heartbeat, the king wavered, exhaustion warring with duty. pragmatism battling honor. Then Theoden smiled, fierce, wild, the expression of someone who'd been given a second chance at life and refused to waste it. "One more charge," he agreed, "and this time, Captain, we ride together until it's done." Below them, Gandalf's 2,000 riders crashed into the Uruk-hai rear with the force of divine judgment. The wizard's staff blazed with light that made Uruk scream and shields crack. Cavalry lances punched through armor. The roar of Eomer, Eomer echoed across the killing field. "Forth, your lingas!" Theoden screamed, wheeling his horse back toward the chaos. "Death! Death! Death!" The riders of Rohan took up the cry. "Death! Death! Death!" They charged. Steve kicked Shadowmere into motion, feeling the warhorse respond despite exhaustion, despite injury. Because that's what warhorses did. Behind him, 300 riders, now 280, he'd lost 20 in the first charge, followed their king into the maelstrom one final time. This time would be different. This time they weren't breaking a prepared line. They were hitting an army already engaged on two fronts, already disorganized, already afraid. This time, they were the avalanche. Steve's shield led the way. Vibranium caught morning sunlight and threw it back in blinding flashes. Uruk-hai, who'd survived the first charge and thought themselves safe, suddenly faced the star-marked warrior again, and Steve saw recognition in their eyes. Fear. He crashed into them like judgment, shields sweeping in wide arcs that sent bodies flying. Shadowmere's hooves rising and falling like pistons. The gap between Steve and Theoden's position closed, then disappeared. They fought side by side, king and displaced warrior, separated by worlds but united by purpose. Gimli was bellowing his count. 37, 38, still ahead of you, Legolas." 42, the elf called back, bow singing. "And you're counting the ones the horse trampled. That's cheating." "Horse did the work, but I was on the horse. Close enough." Despite everything, the violence, the fear, the knowledge that each second could bring death, Steve found himself grinning. These people, these impossible, wonderful, crazy people who faced annihilation with jokes and courage. He'd found his kind. The Uruk-hai line finally broke, completely, utterly. Individuals throwing down weapons and running. Officers trying to rally them, getting trampled by their own fleeing soldiers. The coordinated army that had besieged Helm's Deep dissolved into a mob of terrified creatures desperate to escape. Gandalf's voice boomed across the battlefield, amplified by power Steve didn't understand. "Let none escape. Saruman's evil ends here." What followed wasn't battle. It was execution. The Uruk-hai, caught between mountains and cavalry, were slaughtered without mercy. Steve wanted to feel something about it, remorse perhaps, or at least discomfort. But these weren't soldiers. They were biological weapons created for extinction. Letting them escape meant condemning other innocents to death. So he fought, efficiently, without joy but without hesitation. By the time full morning had arrived, the plains before Helm's Deep were carpeted with bodies. Smoke rose from oil fires. Wounded men and horses screamed. The smell of death hung thick enough to taste, and Steve Rogers, Captain America, sat on an exhausted warhorse surrounded by the aftermath of his first battle in Middle-earth, wondering how the hell he was going to get home.